My name is Stephen Boydston. I'm from the Austin, Texas office of American Institutes for Research, or AIR, and I just want to thank everyone for joining us today for the second session of this two-part workshop on scoping review methods for producing research syntheses. This workshop is offered through the Center on Knowledge Translation for Disability and Rehabilitation Research, or KTDRR, which is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDLR. Last month was the first session, and it was provided an introduction to scoping reviews and synthesizing research. Our faculty, Dr. Chad Nye and Dr. Oliver Vent, covered an overview and examples of current approaches for conducting scoping reviews and applying them to the literature in disability and rehabilitation. So now I would like to introduce our faculty for this workshop today, who have worked with us in the past on training related to systematic reviews, single subject designs, and research syntheses. First, we have Dr. Chad Nye, who's a former executive director of the Center for Autism and Related Disabilities and professor at the University of Central Florida, College of Health and Public Affairs. He has many years of experience in the area of meta-analysis and systematic review of intervention evidence, including in the area of disability. He is an author on several systematic reviews and has served as an editor and coordinator for the Campbell Collaboration Education Coordinating Group. Today we also have Ms. Ginny Brunton, a Senior Research Officer at the Evidence for Policy and Practice Information and Coordinating Center, or the EPI Center, Department of Social Science, University College London in the United Kingdom. Originally a nurse and a midwife, Ms. Brunton has over 20 years experience in the conduct and methodological development of a wide range of mixed method systematic reviews in public health and health promotion. So thank you, Chad and Ginny. Please feel free to begin.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Stephen. So this is Ginny here. I would like to start off with this first slide, reflecting the fact that I'm based in London, but a shout out to what looks like a lot of Canadians in the audience. Welcome. It's nice to be to know that you're out there and interested in scoping reviews. So what I'm going to start with is to remind you that this is just a refresher of your last session on scoping reviews and to set the stage for today's more detailed discussion of the methods. Probably a little bit of context about the work I do. I've been, as Stephen mentioned, I've been doing systematic reviews in London for the Epicenter for, the past 16 years. And before that, I was at McMaster University in Hamilton in Canada, doing systematic reviews as well. The work I do in London is a program of work that's been commissioned by the Department of Health for England, so it's sort of like Health Canada. They have various policy teams who ask us to do systematic reviews on different topics in public health and health promotion. And generally, the scoping reviews that we do are part of a full systematic review that does meta-analysis or some kind of qualitative synthesis. But we also do standalone scoping reviews as well. So, in talking about scoping reviews, it's important to mention that they are a useful product in their own right. So, as I said, we've done scoping reviews on their own in relation to policy questions. So, for example, last year we did a systematic review that was actually a scoping review looking at what the breadth of literature was around sex-selective abortion. But then we also do systematic reviews that go through, they're full systematic reviews, they go through to meta-analysis. And scoping reviews are part of that process. So an example of that would be a review we did last year on hepatitis C, where we were looking at all kinds of chronic conditions that were associated with hepatitis C. And from looking at the breadth of that literature, we were able to narrow down to some specific conditions that were of interest that we then put forward into meta-analysis. So they can be a product in their own right. They can be a stage in the review process. So the hepatitis C example is a way of demonstrating that you can allow narrowing of a research question and criteria for studies included in synthesis. And scoping reviews in that case provide a context to assist the interpretation for a future synthesis. So they're quite a useful little design to have. Probably you had some discussion about this last month in the workshop that Chad and Oliver ran, where there's a lot of different ways that scoping reviews are described. The rate of development of new approaches to reviewing is very rapid, and there's overlap of approaches, and there's a lack of agreement about the terminology. Some people call them scoping reviews. We tend to call them mapping. Some people just call them brief evidence assessments. Other people call them rapid evidence assessments, but I think that's actually a different study design, review design. So there's a lot of different terms floating around out there. The task of developing a system for classifying or categorizing review types is, at the moment, rather challenging. It's probably more useful to try and identify the key dimensions on which reviews differ, so we can examine the ways in which reviews can be created with different combinations of those dimensions. And as a way of illustrating that, there are different ways in which reviews differ from each other. Different types of reviews differ from each other. So the questions, the review questions that get asked, and the conceptual framework on which those questions are built can differ between scoping reviews and full systematic reviews. The types of studies that get considered can differ. Whether or not you do a single component review or a multi-component review. So a multi-component review for me would be, for example, combining evidence from experimental studies with evidence from qualitative research in a mixed method synthesis. They might also differ on the breadth, the depth in which you want to look at the issue and the time that you have available. That certainly impacts on what our reviews end up looking like. Also the methods of the review and whether or not you are trying to aggregate or sort of pile up findings like you would in a meta-analysis, or whether you're trying to configure findings as in a qualitative synthesis. And you know, a lot of these steps, the steps that follow these, could easily apply to other types of review. Knowledge about the nature and strengths of different forms of review is important because it can help you to select the appropriate methods to suit your research question, or to consider the importance of different issues of quality and reporting and accountability when interpreting reviews. The nature of a review question, the assumptions that underlie that question, or the conceptual framework, might strongly suggest which methods of review are appropriate. Reviews might ask the same question, but because of differences in ways that they've defined key elements of that question, like the population or the intervention or the setting, because the scope of reviews is slightly different, they include different studies and then come to different conclusions. So there's a lot of different ways in which reviews can differ from each other in terms of their design. Okay, so reviews in general, we think that what a review looks like will depend on the interplay of several factors. So that's what these triangles are on the right-hand side of the screen. They might depend on the extent of the work to be done in a review. So, for example, how much work is likely to result from the question that you're asking, whether you're asking a very broad question about, I'll use teenage pregnancy as an example, or you're asking a very specific question about a particular type of treatment for a specific condition, looking at a specific outcome. So that's the top triangle, the extent of the work. They might also differ in the time and resources available to address the questions, which is the bottom right-hand triangle. Reviews, in my experience, reviews can run anywhere from 2 years in length to 6 weeks. Scoping reviews generally are at the 6-week mark, and full systematic reviews tend to be at the 2-year mark. But again, every review is different, and you need to take that into consideration. The breadth and depth in which the literature is being looked at, or the left-hand triangle on the bottom there. Again, it could be whether or not you're trying to explore all of the issues around a particular topic, or you're just looking at a slice of it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And finally, the triangle in the middle, the epistemology or the philosophical stance of the research team. Are you doing this to test an already existing theory of how things work, or are you actually trying to generate that theory? That will depend on the design of review that you use. So those are the different dimensions on which reviews can differ. Steps in a scoping review. The next slide. These are the steps that our research team generally undertakes when we're doing scoping reviews and full systematic reviews to some extent. We do reviews for health and social policy, and we have a very close working relationship with national policy teams. So our experience might be quite different to your context, but the steps can be applied across settings. We think it's important, and what I'll do now is just go through these different stages and talk about issues within each of them. So the first stage is to consult stakeholders. Who are stakeholders? Well, they can actually be quite broad. We'd encourage you to think quite broadly about who your stakeholders could be. These are all examples of the types of stakeholders we've involved in our reviews in the past, and often all at the same time. So they could be recipients of services, they could be employers, industry unions, pressure groups, other members of the public. Practitioners like teachers or health professionals are often involved. Service managers, managers and policymakers, from local organizations right through to central government. And of course other researchers who have specific knowledge in the field. Why would you bother involving stakeholders? Well, we put a lot of emphasis on the objective, transparent, and accountable nature of reviews. But if we accept that the subjectivity that's present when we're framing the question in choosing the review methods and interpreting the findings, and we acknowledge that our own experience, knowledge, and perspectives might be limited. So it's always good to have more perspectives to bring to bear on those issues. By incorporating a range of perspectives and expertise, we can check our own assumptions, we can ensure the relevance of the review to those people who are going to be affected by the findings, and to possibly anticipate or fend off criticism at an early stage. Researchers and stakeholders learn from each other to gain a full understanding of a review and its purpose. We can move from a push model where researchers write about what they're interested in towards an exchange model where the users or the stakeholders provide information that shapes the scope of the review. All of this, we think, improves the inclusiveness and the transparency of processes, and it makes more effective use of feedback from the end users to increase the likelihood that we're going to produce reviews that are relevant and useful. There's nothing worse than going through all that effort to do a piece of research and then it sits on a shelf someplace and doesn't get used. So it's good to involve stakeholders. There's lots of different ways you can involve them. They can be involved to different levels, I guess. They can be consulted on an issue. They can collaborate with you on making decisions and actually undertaking the review process, or they can completely control the review process. This can involve any of a range of active involvement activities. So they could be members of a review group, an advisory panel, or a focus group. They could be brought in to help set the initial question and help influence the theoretical framework. They can identify studies They can take part in day-to-day review activities, refine questions for the in-depth review, and definitely communicate, interpret, and apply the findings. Just in terms of helping to set the initial question and influencing the theoretical framework, I think I'm going to talk about that in a few slides, so I'll just hold off. Of course, there's other ways of accessing user or stakeholder perspectives, and that's to actually do systematic reviews on research about the public's views. And so we quite often integrate those kinds of qualitative research studies into our systematic reviews, and they're quite interesting to do. Of course, there's the practicalities about stakeholder consultation. You need to build in time to design a scoping review, particularly if you're working with stakeholders, because it can take time to come to a common language. You need to think about when they should be brought in. We'd say early and throughout the review process, because they can inform different stages of the review in so many different ways. And you need to recognize that how you involve them and when you involve them will probably differ from one project to another. So, for example, we did this review looking at conditions that were associated with hepatitis C. And that research question, or the review questions that we did, were set by the policy team before we started. So we didn't have a chance to undertake the kind of stakeholder consultation we would have liked, because when we subsequently went out and sought the views of stakeholder groups, they were a bit critical about why that particular question had been framed, and remarked that they would have liked to have been involved in shaping the research questions a bit more in order to get a product that was going to be useful for them. So related to that, you need to be clear about the purpose of the map, and its claims should not exceed its warrant. So if you're clear about why a scoping review or a map is being undertaken, or a systematic review for that matter, and that's communicated in the write-up of the report, it's very clear to readers whether or not the findings that you come up with and the conclusions that you draw meet the purpose for which the review was done and doesn't go beyond that. So its claim should not exceed its warrant is just kind of an old-fashioned way of saying don't go beyond what you've set out to do, and make sure that if you're involving stakeholders that they know what the purpose of the scoping review is going to be and how the findings will feed into that. And related to that, you need to consider the amount of understanding or complexity that has to be integrated in the answer provided by the scoping review. So aim to fit the findings to the audience's needs in terms of the populations, the related concepts, and the processes that are in the review. So that's quite a big step at the beginning. The next step is to actually set the review question. In setting a review question, it's considered an investigative statement rather than a topic of interest. So it should be clear and answerable, and it's a driver for all review processes. So you should set up a review question so that the analyses directly answer those questions wherever possible. And we also say that it's in a dynamic interplay with theory and with inclusion and exclusion criteria. And what that means is that we go back and forth between a conceptual framework, a research question, and the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And the example I'll give you for that is this teenage pregnancy review that we did a few years ago, where the funders wanted us to do a systematic review with a scoping review at the beginning to look at interventions that might prevent teenage pregnancy and also promote teenage parenthood. And the problem with teenage pregnancy was that England has one of the highest rates in Europe of teenage pregnancy, did at the time. And when we started looking into the background literature, when we were writing the protocol, we realized there was quite a bit of literature that was saying that actually for some teenagers, pregnancy was not a bad thing. They saw that as a normal life event and something that was appropriate for them to be doing at that age. And so the issue was not all teenage pregnancy, it was unintended teenage pregnancy. So in thinking about teenage pregnancy, we had to add that concept about unintended teenage pregnancies. Those were the things we were interested in, the outcomes that we were interested in. And that changed our research question, and it also changed our inclusion and exclusion criteria. So we had to move back and forth between the conceptual framework, thinking about what the issues were around teenage pregnancy, and how that shaped the research question we asked, and then, of course, the inclusion and exclusion criteria we used. In identifying the research questions, you pick out the key domains that need to be explored. So in that example, we'll use Tint and Weiss for an example. There was a review, I think a scoping review that was provided as an example by Tint and Weiss that looked at family well-being of individuals with autism spectrum disorder. And the domains they were looking at were conceptualizations and measurements of family well-being in the ASD literature. So there's basically 4 concepts in that question about conceptualizations, about measurements, about family well-being, and about ASD. The boundaries, again, in the question, you need to set boundaries so that you don't ask such a broad question that you end up with too much literature to screen, or you end up with a lot of topics to have to try and synthesize later on. This is more important, I think, in systematic reviews. But in scoping reviews, you're trying to get a sense of the breadth of the literature, so you may indeed ask a broad question to start with and then narrow it later on when you do a systematic review meta-analysis, when you identify studies for meta-analysis. The wording is also a bit different on a scoping review. Instead of asking directly what is the effectiveness of, for example, this intervention on that outcome, you would tend to ask broader questions like what is the nature or extent of research about an issue, or what research has been undertaken on an issue, so that it's a bit broader, and it will give you an idea of the scope, the breadth of the literature that you're looking for. And I think the Tint and Weiss example on the right-hand side of the screen shows you some examples of these things about the domains that are there, the boundaries, because they're saying they're interested in conceptualizations and measurements. They're not interested in interventions, and they're specific to family well-being. So that's also setting the boundaries that they're looking at, and they're not asking questions about the effectiveness of this on that. They're asking about the breadth of the literature and where there are gaps and limitations. Okay. So there's different ways you can structure your research questions, and this next slide is a way of demonstrating the ways that you could do that, and probably you've heard of these. Peacock is a way of structuring your research question according to population, intervention, comparator, outcome, and context. Otherwise, you can use Eclipse, which looks at expectation, client group, location, impact, providers, and service, or SPIDER, which looks at sample, phenomenon of interest, design, evaluation, and research type. Having that kind of structure in place makes it much easier to set up your analyses later on if you go through to systematic review meta-analysis, but also, or qualitative synthesis, but it also helps you with searching, which is the next stage. And that picture is supposed to be a needle in a haystack. I'm not sure you can see that well or not, but sometimes that's what searching feels like to me. So common characteristics of systematic searching. So whether you're doing systematic reviews or scoping reviews, search strategies are intended to find studies that might be relevant for the review's question. So you're always going to look, hopefully, hopefully more broadly. You're going to find more than you actually need. The search strategy should be derived from the review question, and they need to be practically constrained. And what that means is by your database limitations, so maybe you don't have access to all the databases that are possible. Maybe you have restricted time in which to do searching, or you have restricted resources. So there's practical constraints. There's also a need to support your search strategy with a rationale so that you consider and explain the choice of the sources that you search and the terms that you use. And it needs to be explicitly reported so that other people can assess the quality of the search that you've undertaken to decide whether it fits the need or the purpose of the review. So if you're undertaking a scoping review, for example, you might consider searching in a wide variety of sources. And by publishing or making explicit your search strategy for other people to see, they can make a judgment on whether or not you did search widely enough to be able to identify all of the issues around that topic that you're studying. And lastly, a search strategy should be iterative. So we spend a fair bit of time drafting and testing search strategies to get all of the terms, the correct terms in there, and all the limits in that we need to have before we actually implement a structured search plan. And some people call that a search strategy. There's lots of different sources that you can look, as you probably know. So there's bibliographic databases, and there's loads of different types. There's general ones like ERIC or Medline or EconLit that look across, so they tend to be discipline specific. But there's also specialized bibliographic databases like OpenGray, which is a source of gray literature. There's internet search engines and gateways like Google Scholar or Policy Hub that are being increasingly used. And there's issues around using those. There's hand-searching journals and websites, and scanning reference lists, forward citation searching, and professional contacts and key authors or experts. The thing to remember is that bibliographic databases are only one way of finding literature for a scoping review or a full systematic review, and you need to look at a variety of sources in order to locate the most relevant research. And that's generally because it'll be dependent on the topic that you're researching, where you think it's most likely that the literature is going to be located, but also where you think the hard-to-find literature is going to be located. So, for example, if we were doing a qualitative synthesis where we were looking at people's views about what factors promoted successful teenage parenthood, we probably wouldn't look in Medline. We would look in Medline, but we wouldn't expect to find a whole lot of literature, a qualitative literature, asking teenagers what they think about becoming a parent is like. We'd be more inclined, and we were more inclined, to find it in sociological databases. And also an awful lot were found on citation searching and just website searching of key organizations. So it depends on what kind of question you're asking and the nature of the research you're looking at, where you're likely to find it. it's important when you're searching to balance the feasibility of searching lots of different sources with the breadth and comprehensiveness of the scoping process. So it depends on how much time you have. You might need to limit the sources rather than the search terms. You might want to limit by dates, especially if there's a key date at which practice changed that would justify limiting by that date, looking for research, because that changed practice so much that everything after that date would look substantially different in the research literature. You could limit by that date. You may limit by study designs where it's possible. It's not always possible to do that. If there isn't a whole lot of randomized control trials on a topic, you may need to broaden what you look for. And maybe before-after studies are the best you're going to get. So you have to consider what kind of studies are likely to answer your question. And like I said, don't rely on databases alone. Approaches to searching, there's a couple of different ways to do it. It used to be we did lots of comprehensive searching. So the idea is to find all of the studies that answer the review question, and that means searching exhaustively and in multiple sources, using really broad search terms to try and find every possible bit of literature. If you can't search that broadly, or if you get too much literature back from doing that, especially with scoping reviews where you may be asking broad questions, an unbiased sample is the next best alternative. So you might, a review that I did a few years ago on women's experiences of becoming a mother found quite a lot of qualitative literature on experiences of motherhood, and we couldn't possibly synthesize all of it in time, so we ended up taking a random sample of a subset of studies and synthesizing them. So it is possible to do those kinds of things when you're short on time, as long as you communicate your rationale for doing it to justify that decision. So that was kind of traditionally, that's what's been done in searching. More recently, there's been an approach called purposive searching, where you identify some main themes in the literature, and this can sometimes use saturation sampling, and you search on those particular main themes. And search plans in this case might develop as new evidence comes to light. So this is a much more iterative way to search, and it tends to be used when you're trying to look for you're trying to develop theory as you're going along, okay, so more in qualitative syntheses. And there is a professor up at University of Sheffield by the name of Andrew Booth who's written quite a bit on this. So those are the two broad approaches to searching that you can undertake. And to search, you also need to use a combination of controlled and free text terms when you're actually searching in databases. So most databases use some kind of standardized controlled terms to describe papers. So in Medline, they're mesh terms. In ASIA, they're subject headings. In ERIC, they're called descriptors. But they're controlled terms that get applied to each study that gets put into those databases, and then you can search them. The scope notes generally define what the controlled terms mean for indexers, and then also for systematic reviewers. So we know which controlled terms to use for a particular concept. You need to use controlled terms for each concept in your review, and check the controlled terms that are applied to known relevant studies. So, you know, in the abstracts where they have keywords at the bottom of the abstract, you can use those to help you identify what the controlled terms are in the databases. But it's also important that you supplement this with non-indexed free text terms, because sometimes new concepts haven't been made into controlled terms in these databases yet. So a recent phenomenon, for example, that's happened in maternity is a concept of free birthing. So women give birth at home without any healthcare provider present at all. And that hasn't been indexed yet as a controlled term. So if you were doing that kind of a search, for example, you would want to use that kind of free text term to try and pick up that concept as part of your search strategy. Okay, and so that's a taster of the kinds of things that you might consider in setting a research question involving stakeholders and setting up your search strategy. And I'm going to turn you over to Chad now to talk a bit more about study selection and classification.
Thanks, Jenny. Welcome to all of you who have tuned in today. So let's assume for a moment you've got a well-prescribed, described, refined question to address an issue that's of importance to you, and you have done the search using all of the terms and strategies that has generated a collection of potential sources that could be included in the review. So for the next few minutes, my section on this is how do we deal with all of that data? How do we deal with these studies, sources, in terms of what goes in to a review, and how do we organize and manage that information, that data? So let me start with kind of what I call an initial level decision. There are two stages at which we typically do determination of whether or not a study is to be included. The first stage is at the title and abstract stage. That is, we have the title, we have the abstract from the search, and we can make some determination as to whether or not this study is a potential study for inclusion, and at the same time, we can also recognize studies that clearly are not part of the review process. So it helps at least in managing the time and effort and so forth, unless you just really get a charge out of reading every single study that you've collected. This is at least a way to maximize some of the resources available. So let's assume for a minute, and I've just chosen a topic, somewhat based on earlier grant work that we've done, but what if you're interested in employment strategies for adults with autism? Now, in this case, I'm treating it strategies as an intervention. It could be parents' perception of employers who hire individuals with autism. The topic would not necessarily be intervention, but I'm using that here. So I asked the first question. I have study number one on my list of 3,272 studies, and it says, I look at the title of it and say, does the title tell me that this is an intervention study? If the answer is yes, I'm going to go to question two. If the answer is no, it clearly shows in the abstract that it's not an intervention study, then that study's not eligible for inclusion, at least not in this review. You can also have an unclear category. That is, you're not quite sure. There's sort of a indication, if you please, that there might be, this might work. So I use unclear as a proceed forward category. So I would simply circle one of the three and act accordingly. So let's assume for a moment that it's yes. It clearly is an intervention study. They even use that term in the title. I would then go to number two and want to try to define adults here. So I've said, what are the participants at least 18 years of age? Now, you may not find that in the title, but you may well find it in the abstract. And sure enough, I find it there. It's yes, then I can move forward. If it's unclear, I move forward. If it's no, then it can be an intervention study, but it wasn't with 18-year-olds. It was an intervention study perhaps with school transition. If you're not interested in school transition, then that would eliminate that study from inclusion. This all depends on the criteria that you establish before you begin the process here, and I'm going to talk about that more in a few moments. But let's assume that it's yes here. So now we go down to the third question, and does this sort of fit the aim of the study, the focus of the study, the intent? If the answer is yes, you go get the full study, and it is at least a possible inclusion, but it's met at least two of the basic criteria for including it. If it doesn't meet your criteria, at least in terms of the aim of the study, then that's a decision that you make, and it doesn't necessarily go for inclusion. Unclear, again, is get the full text. So that whole idea of unclear is a way that I kind of look at it and say there's just something about it. Now, the reality of it is that majority of the studies that we might use or sources would be yes or no. Unclear is not a huge number, but it does result in including some studies that you might otherwise exclude that do meet the criteria for inclusion. So unclear is kind of a qualified yes, if you please. So we're going to assume for a minute that this decision was accurate, that we've included the studies that really should be included. We're now going to move to kind of a second level of inclusion that's going to involve the full text of the studies. That is, we're going to get the information from the actual studies. To do that, it's kind of some principles of the criteria that we use here to determine inclusion and exclusion. Certainly the relevance of the study is kind of based on these pre-selected criteria, and that's in part why that construction of the question at the outset is so important, because that guides is a major guide for which studies will be part of the review. It's also important for these criteria to be defined in advance in order to have a consistency in what criteria were used to select the studies, which leads us to the ability to be able to justify selection when somebody complains that we just screwed it all up and it really wasn't the case. You can have the situation where somebody disagrees with your selection, but if the criteria are clearly sort of implemented, then okay, you can differ on the basis of the criteria that you implemented, but it wasn't that an arbitrary decision that you made to select a study and include it in the process. So it kind of aids in that reducing the bias in the selection process. Choosing a set of studies that proves your point of view is not what the purpose of a scoping review is all about. It helps us specify which studies are in and which studies are out. This can be modified, and as Jenny explained about the selection process, as new information is acquired along the way. Perhaps information you didn't know existed or hadn't thought about or hadn't been considered, it can be sort of integrated into the process here and into the procedures that you need to collect and manage the information. So we're trying to get to a basic collecting a rigorous, defensible set of data. That is the best organization of information that we can come up with. The broader this broad and narrow, Jenny spoke about, kind of from a resource point of view, I guess. If you have too strict a criteria, that is, it's so narrow, you don't get a lot of included studies, then you may not have generalizable to a population. On the other hand, if it's so broad that you've included thousands of studies, then you may have less confidence in the results. So there's a balance in there that in part is determined by your particular interest, point of view, resources, and ultimately the question as you designed it for purposes of the review. Okay, so in terms of the characteristics of a study, these generally follow what go into what we see in a study. These are categories. These are not necessarily the only issues or points of concern, consideration here, but this is at least sort of a general one that can be used in the PICO or the ellipse, those spider, the other outlines that Jenny provided to you a few minutes ago. So we want to look at participant characteristics, intervention or focus characteristics, study methodological, outcome, measure, and study design. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the characteristics here, but I want to give you a few samples just so you understand at least where we go with these categories. This process of identifying these elements within the studies will in part determine how we'll go about managing this data for the summary process later on. So if we're looking at participant characteristics, these might be a basic set, some of which may be of some interest to you, specifically to your topic and subject. I mean, there's nothing particularly earth-shattering about it. We expect to see most of this in one form or another. We expect to see this in most studies. I will say, while I expect to see it in most studies, I'm frequently, I'm not surprised anymore, but I frequently find that some of the basic information isn't there, and there's some value in that as well, and I'll talk about that in a bit. If we were looking at intervention characteristics, we might want to identify what types of treatment were included either in some categorical classification name, could be a commercial treatment type, but we identify treatment type. We can dosage could be part of the catalog here of information. Number of sessions, I'm using the word sessions in the case of employment. It could be number of work days, could be number of days per week, could be number of weeks, the length of the program, how long did they follow and evaluate supported employment, for example. A study that would have a length of a year, 52 weeks, is perhaps a significantly different, has a specifically different outcome than one that lasted 4 weeks. So that may be of interest. Treatment groupings, individual versus group or combinations of them. You may not have these types of treatment for the area you're in, but as intervention characteristics. But the point being that there are, in the characteristic category, these are at least ones that are commonly found in the literature for interventions. If we're talking about study and methodological treatments, you may want to extract some of these or all of these. I see or have people say, why would you care about the year of publication? Well, if you're interested in looking at sort of the process of the development of an intervention type or of interventions, then that provides you sort of a coding mechanism to identify that. If it were outcome measures, are they standardized? Are they surveys? Are they focus groups? What's the measure that's used to collect the data from the study? If it's a study source, is it published literature or unpublished? Some people have a real aversion to unpublished literature when it comes to summarizing data, particularly in the qualitative arena, as it were. Is it agency reports, grant reports? Do focus groups fall into the category here? So this is just another category of methodological consideration. Study design is one that causes some folks, at least, apoplexy along the way. But the fact of the matter is that the design as a methodological issue can provide some useful information, at least in terms of the nature of the research that's evident in a given area. So assuming we've got all of this material, how do we handle it? Well, I use a coding form. Now, I'm going to show you some sort of quick examples of 2 or 3 within those areas, if for those of you who may not be familiar with the coding form, for those of you who are, have somebody wake you up when I get through 3 or 4 slides here. The coding form is the tool, if you please, for organizing the data that's going to be used in summarizing the studies. Is it required? No. It's a useful way of organizing a lot of information. I don't know about you, but the older I get, the harder it is to remember this, where this stuff was and where it came from and who said it. So put it in writing, and at least helps me to have some explanation of the information. So suppose your coding form, you wanted to know about SES. So I have a form, and take each of those categories from that I showed you there in that outline of the characteristics, and I simply identify what the categories are, and then note that, circle it if it's presented in the text. You notice I have a little page thing at the top, and I know it probably sounds extremely simplistic, but I can assure you, at some point, you're going to want to know somebody's going to say, where did you see that? And you're going to spend 10 minutes looking back through the study trying to find that one paragraph to identify where you saw the notation that brought you to make the decision. Every characteristic, whether it's participant or intervention or outcome, is sort of formatted along this way. You identify the topics and then a simple way of noting them. If it were intervention, perhaps in the treatment types, these are 3 types of treatment that you see here. There could be others, and you might well find those sort of after the fact of making the determination about what included, excluded criteria you set up at the beginning. So you simply add them to the catalog here to be able to note them. If it were methodological, if you're interested in the recruitment source, where did they get these participants from that were then assigned to the interventions that were identified earlier? Another sort of mechanism for summarizing important features within the study itself. Let me also say that at least in some instances anyway, we go beyond just the coding form. One of the things that I have over the years developed, that I use regularly, is a code book. That is, I set up the coding sheet and identify those inclusion-exclusion criteria, and then I define what those terms mean. So shelter workshop would have a definition. There's going to be more than one person typically involved in this process, so it does help in being able to coordinate and have some reliability between observers. So also in most reviews there are at least 2 reviewers. So what do you do when somebody disagrees, 2 people disagree? Well, at both the title and abstract stage and at the full text stage, we have 2 reviewers. If there is, well, we do the coding of a study, and then we sit down together and go through and compare. Did we come up with the same results? Did we circle the same numbers, if you please? And if we didn't, then we have to discuss this, go back to the studies, review it, and convince one or the other that they were right and or I was right and they were wrong, and we come to a consensus agreement. If we can't agree, if we really don't believe that the other person's point of view is accurate, we go to a third reviewer and sort of use the whoever scores the most wins. And it at least allows us to have a justification for including or excluding a study on the basis of these criteria. So all of those characteristics that we talked about for considering can be formatted in this coding form that would be the tool that you would use to extract data. This is data extraction process from typically from the methods section. Some of it comes from results as well. Let me also talk about the quality of evidence. As I mentioned in the last session, there is, how should I say, there is a controversy issue among scoping review methodologists as to whether or not quality of evidence should be included. I said then, and I say it again, I'm presenting this as a proponent of coding the quality of the evidence as part of the review process. I just think it's important for you to realize that not everybody holds to that view. It seems to me that as in the more recent years, there has been an increasing presentation in the methodological literature for scoping reviews in support of the quality of evidence in some measure. So what I'm suggesting here is that you think about that as an issue. Here's the kind of the hierarchy that the quantifiable reviewers will use, without getting into too deep of water. We refer to the randomized trial as the gold standard, which probably causes great anxiety to the single subject community. Point being that at least it's a way of identifying quality of evidence for literature that we're trying to quantify. That is, the studies that present statistical analyses that is not qualitative in nature. That doesn't mean you can't use qualitative literature. Though qualitative studies don't have quality of evidence, they do have strength of evidence. So you just have to recognize and account for, if that is part of your review, scope of review, that in qualitative evidence, if you want to have some judgment about the hierarchy of evidence in that domain, that you need to think of and look at the strength of evidence and the tools that are available for assessing that. One of these types of designs will allow you to do that. So my summary is, I think quality of evidence is important and is worth considering a scoping review, at least to the extent that it does provide you with another way to organize the presentation or the summarizing of the literature that falls under your topic of interest. The most common way that, at least initially, the data are presented in scoping reviews is often just simple charting of data. This won't be earth-shattering to anybody. We'll come up with a sample of it and on screen in a couple of more slides. If you were involved with something like the Joanna Briggs criteria or production of a scoping review, you would do a protocol. That is, you would establish, before you ever started the review, kind of the procedures that would be used. And that would be a place where you might present the plan for how you're going to extract and present the data in a chart or a table. It is, as with the coding form, it's kind of a living document. It can be refined, and certainly the closer you get to completion, where you have a more robust picture of the evidence that's being used, then you may be able to modify how you're going to present it based on that that kind of evidence. It's not as fixed as in fixed a concept as in some other areas. Scoping reviews, charting is the data extraction summary point. You could and you should early on code a few studies, reconcile with another reviewer, and then pilot that by trying to see how that information fits into a chart. Now, I didn't say earlier, but the coding form is translated or transferred into a spreadsheet. So it's fairly easy to tabulate and get a descriptive summary of those characteristics and features within the studies that are potentially included. And if there's new data that sort of comes along, if you please, that you hadn't anticipated, this is a place and point where it can also be modified. The presentation of the charts can be done in the form of maps, could be diagrams, tabular forms, line charts, bar graphs, descriptive format that sort of lets you express what you have found in this literature without drawing conclusions of a statistical nature. Remember, we're scoping, we're kind of doing the 30,000-foot view in a sense of trying to organize what could be a fairly large number of studies, and we're trying to describe it. It's an instructive process rather than a definitive, this is the way it is process. As Jenny mentioned earlier, the PICO and those kind of formats can be used. A basic one is this PCC format, participants, concept, context, is kind of a beginning point or starting point. Those are excellent tools for at least thinking about the kind of information that needs to be collected and extracted, and the information that might go into some sort of a summary form. These are potential categories that comes out of the characteristics for inclusion and exclusion. It's similar across, or these are some of the very characteristics that I presented to you earlier. This is a sample chart. Think of this in a horizontal here. The bottom half of this would extend out to the right, so you'd have a horizontal presentation. But as you can see, there is short summary narratives of major issues for a given study, and if all of the studies kind of are organized into this kind of format, we see this regularly in our literature. This is not particularly earth-shattering by any stretch. But the charting is a common way of summarizing the findings in a non-narrative form in a scoping review. So key differences, at least between the scoping and a systematic review. Scoping review is an overview of literature. It is synthesis, particularly from a quantifiable side of the ledger, is minimal often, and it's more than minimal. It may not even exist. That's not the purpose of it. It tends to be narrative in summary. Whether or not you do a quality assessment is dependent on your point of view and the resources available and so forth. How that summarization takes place is again in part determined by the scope of the review, the question, the focus of the question, and how the data best fits into presentation in a way that summarizes the overarching information within the literature available on the subject. And with that, I will turn it back to Jenny and talk about the summarizing of reports.
Okay, thanks for that. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, go ahead, Jenny.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Stephen. Okay, so summarizing summarizing your findings needs to happen, mostly because data is not information, information isn't knowledge, and knowledge isn't wisdom. You can have the files, it doesn't mean you have the answer. So there's some steps that you have to go through to get to that answer, if you like. There's roughly 3 different ways of summarizing when you're talking about scoping reviews, certainly. The first way is numeric. And again, I used the Tint and Weiss scoping review that looked at family well-being and ASD. So you can have a numeric summary where the quote that we've got here, well-being was used interchangeably with adjustment, and how many studies reported well-being as adjustment, how many reported it in terms of physical health, how many reported it in terms of mental health, stress, and depression. So it's just a summing up of your codes, really, that you may have used in your charting. And you see that quite often. You get that kind of descriptive descriptive analysis of just frequencies of codes that describe the research along those different characteristics that you looked at in the charting process. You can also do a narrative approach. You can summarize by taking a narrative approach, and Tint and Weiss also did some of this. And the particular quote that I used was, across studies, family well-being was consistently viewed with positive connotations. So it's more like telling a story. You're looking at what the study said and just kind of describing narratively what the different findings were, or how generally the studies were reported. And then the third method is a thematic approach, which to me is a little bit more detailed than a narrative approach. There you're actually looking for patterns in the data and pulling them out as themes that occur across the set of studies. And again, Tint and Weiss handily provide a nice illustration of this. They talk about one approach was to view family well-being as a subjective concept in itself that leads to physical and mental health outcomes, but a contrasting approach was to view well-being as a collection of different constructs. In these situations, physical and mental health were seen as components of the overall well-being composite. So they're talking about family well-being as a subjective concept and family well-being as a collection of different constructs. So they've pulled out 2 different themes from the studies that they looked at as part of the scoping review. So there's different ways of trying to pull together that data to make some sense of the findings. When you're synthesizing, once you've got some findings, that's great. But the next bit is that you need some help understanding them. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier about stakeholder engagement and how we have a particular perspective, but actually the people who are ultimately hopefully going to be affected by the scoping review may have a different perspective. So it's always good to try and talk to them about what they think about the findings. You might consult with stakeholders to sense check the findings against the original questions and the implications of those findings against the reasons why the scoping review was commissioned in the first place. So that's a way of making sure that the findings that you got make sense to the people who are going to read the report, and also to make sure that the findings don't go beyond why the review was commissioned in the first place. Now, as I said earlier, typically we tend to do scoping reviews within full systematic reviews. So this is the point at which we would present these findings to an advisory group of usually multidisciplinary stakeholders, and they would help us to identify priority areas for in-depth synthesis. For example, meta-analysis or qualitative synthesis, depending on what the review design in question was all about. So it's quite a useful exercise. So I gave that example of hepatitis C and conditions that are associated with hepatitis C. And we scoped that literature and came up with 192 different conditions that might be associated with hepatitis C. Far too many to do meta-analyses on. And so we did a lot of stakeholder consultation about what factors, what conditions influenced quality of life in people who had hep C. And the research literature was telling us it was things like conditions like diabetes or leukemia or cardiovascular problems. And when we went and talked to the stakeholders, so these are actually people who were living with hepatitis C and had experienced these conditions, they were saying actually for them what impacts their quality of life are things like depression, anxiety, pain, cognitive function. So there was a big gap between what people who lived with the condition said affected their quality of life and what had actually been researched. So those conditions, some of them had been researched fairly thoroughly, but they certainly weren't as researched as diabetes and, you know, conditions that can be more easily researched, really. So it's good to consult to get that perspective. Once you've interpreted the findings, you need to communicate them. So you need to think about how you're going to tell the story. And that might be considering who you're trying to communicate to, policymakers, practitioners, people who are experiencing the issue that you're studying, what kinds of things you're going to communicate to them. Are they interested in findings, or are they academics who are really interested in the methods? How you structure your communication tool will depend on that. Where you might communicate, so journal articles, newsletters, the usual. When are you going to communicate? Are you going to present findings at the beginning? So, for example, publish a protocol so that people can see what you're going to do. Whether you're going to publish something in the middle so that people can see interim findings, or at the end of the process. And why you're trying to communicate. You know, what are you trying to achieve by communicating? Are you trying to influence policy? Are you trying to change practice? Are you, well, yeah, we'll just go with those. In doing this, you need to report your rationale for doing the scoping review. That's really important because, again, you need to make sure that the reason you undertook it, the findings, speak to that reason and they don't go beyond that reason. You need to report the research questions so that people understand exactly what you were asking, so that they can see whether the analyses that you undertook or the summaries that you undertook actually address those questions, and what purpose the report or the research is ultimately meant to serve. And this prevents misuse of the report. So there can be a worry that in doing a scoping review, so especially if you're doing a scoping review to look at interventions, for example, that you could do a scoping review of interventions and you could say, look, this is the breadth of research on these interventions, and you haven't done any quality assessment necessarily of the literature because you're only reporting on the extent of research. You're not reporting on how well it was done. And then you produce that report and it goes out to policymakers, and then they pick it up and say, oh, great, we can implement these interventions. Except they can't because you haven't actually presented them with that kind of product. You're just telling them what the extent of the research is. You're not saying how well it was done. You're not meta-analyzing the findings. You're not considering what might be explaining the findings that you have. So again, it goes back to the purpose for which you undertook the scoping review in the first place, and you need to communicate that quite clearly. You can communicate it in lots of different ways. Obviously, you can do a one-page summary that is, if it's tailored, it's effective. It tends to be more effective than one-page summaries that aren't tailored to a particular audience. You can write a report, which is actually a user-friendly kind of summary, and generally those ones, when we do those sorts of reports, we tend to put the findings first and stick the methods in a technical appendix at the end, because policymakers aren't so interested in the methods. They're much more interested in the findings. You can do a full technical report where the method section is the main part, and it's detailed, and it's right up front for anybody to use or to critique as they want. And you can also provide your data coding so that people can see how you characterize the studies and whether there were any concepts or codes that got missed that should have been put there. So there's lots of different formats that are certainly possible when you're trying to communicate your findings. Now, don't freak out too much about this, this particular model. This is just our way of conceptualizing what evidence-informed policy and practice processes look like. So evidence-informed policy and practice is delineated by that blue oval. And inside that, you have the production of evidence. So that's doing systematic reviews or scoping reviews. And that's, that's conducting the research that we do. As you're probably aware, research evidence may or may not be used in policy and practice for a variety of reasons. And this is represented by the blue two-way arrow that's labeled mediation. Okay? Many factors can mediate whether research evidence gets used ultimately, including things like how tailored the research is to the policy or practice decision being made. For example, is it the right population? Is it the correct issues under study? Are the outcomes relevant for that particular context? The engagement of stakeholders throughout evidence production and evidence use, and that's illustrated by that green box and the little arrows going back and forth, up and down across evidence production and evidence use. Stakeholder engagement throughout that process helps to make the research more relevant and hopefully more used. We position systematic reviews. If I can just click on this. Yep, there it goes. We position systematic reviews and scoping reviews as a mostly evidence production process with some abilities to mediate between research studies and the use of those studies' findings in policy and practice. So we can use systematic reviews to mediate the use of evidence, if that makes sense. And of course, there is a methodological literature that researches evidence production. So it evaluates the effectiveness of various systematic review methods that we use, and methodological literature that evaluates evidence use. So it evaluates how evidence gets used. And this also influences evidence-informed policy and practice too. So that's that blue box on the bottom that's got an arrow going up and down to the whole evidence-informed process. So that's kind of where we see systematic reviews and stakeholder engagement, and ultimately the use of research evidence in policy and practice decisions. Now, the last thing to say, I guess, is that research synthesis, we view that as part of knowledge accumulation. And it's a cycle. So it's a cycle of knowledge accumulation, and research synthesis is conducting systematic reviews or scoping reviews or rapid reviews or qualitative research syntheses. All of those are part of the cycle of knowledge accumulation. So funders or other review users or researchers ask questions about what we know about a topic, so what findings are there, how we know it, which is what's the strength or design of that evidence, and what we want to know, where the gaps are. And you could argue that that first bit is actually, it can be considered a scoping review in itself. Clarifying these into a review question allows us to conduct a systematic review where we actually extract outcomes and we do a meta-analysis, or we do a thematic analysis and do qualitative synthesis. This produces new findings about a topic. These have to be communicated, interpreted, and applied in order to determine whether there's more that we want to know, which is taken back into discussions with funders, other review users, and researchers to begin the cycle again. So we see systematic reviewing as a process of knowledge accumulation, and it involves a lot of interaction with people who use the reviews, and then provide context that allow us to ask further questions that may be researched by systematic review or indeed by primary research. Pat, I have a question. Are you still there?
Chad, are you still with us?
Oh, I'm here.
You're here. I was gonna get you to talk a little bit more about that idea of quality assessment, because I think that's an interesting issue for people to get their heads around, especially if you're doing a full systematic review, where of course you're going to do quality assessment.
Right.
So, and you know, you were saying that you're a proponent of coding the quality of evidence on scoping reviews, and not everybody thinks it's necessary. I'm certainly of the opinion that it should suit, whether you do it or not, suits the reason you're doing the scoping review in the first place.
And Chad, this ties into the question Lisa Engel has put into the chat box as well, so I'm happy to read that off for you if you'd like.
Sure.
So, she asked, can you clarify between how you describe quality of evidence in the presentation as being levels of evidence versus doing methodological quality analysis? Is there danger in calling levels of evidence a quality analysis? For example, a methodologically poor RCT adds nothing to our knowledge.
Yeah, that's what I was attempting to sort of distinguish. They're not the same. That's the point. The quality of evidence is appropriately applied to the sort of typical studies that result in quantifiable evidence, that is, numbers crunched. Whereas the quality of evidence, that's an inappropriate way to evaluate a qualitative review. So the tool that is sort of, kind of fair to say, closely parallels in the quality of evidence has more to do with the strength of the evidence than it does, has to do with strength of evidence, not the quality in terms of quantifiable measurement. So they're two different mechanisms, two different tools. Does that sound right, Jenny? I mean, am I articulating the distinction?
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of issues tied up in Lisa's question, and then, you know, when you start talking about quantitative and qualitative research. What's shown on that slide is a hierarchy of evidence, where you would say, you know, a review design is actually a good way of telling whether a study is robust or not. And as Lisa pointed out in her question, a methodologically poor RCT adds nothing to our knowledge. You could learn more from a really well-conducted cohort observational study that adjusted for, you know, baseline imbalances and so on and so forth. So a hierarchy of evidence will tell you how many systematic reviews were done, how many randomized control trials, but not how well they were done. And you wouldn't necessarily be going in to do quality assessment of all of those different types of studies within a scoping review, particularly if the research question that's being asked is what's the extent of research on a particular topic. Not asking what's the effectiveness. They're not asking a question that requires a careful assessment of how well the research has been done, because the findings of the review are going to inform a policy or practice decision, an instrumental decision to actually, you know, implement that intervention. In that case, you would want a full systematic review with a meta-analysis and full quality assessment of that quantitative evidence. So that's the one issue. I hope that answers Lisa's question. The other issue is, what do you do when you have qualitative studies? So phenomenological studies or grounded theory studies or critical interpretive analysis, and you've got to try and pull those together in some way. There isn't a hierarchy of evidence in qualitative research in the same way that there is on that slide for quantitative research, okay? Because qualitative research is undertaken for different reasons, for theory building or for conceptual understanding, no one design is any better than the other. The design should be the design should be adequate to answer the research question that's asked. So there isn't really a hierarchy as far as that goes. In terms of determining the strength of the evidence, let's go back to quality assessment. You do still quality assess qualitative studies. People can't agree on what's the appropriate quality assessment tool to use for qualitative studies. There's lots of different types of quality assessment tools out there for qualitative studies, and people can't decide on how you determine whether a study is methodologically strong, moderate, or weak in terms of how well it's been carried out. People don't agree on which factors influence the findings more than others. What they do agree on is that a qualitative study should be critically assessed in terms of how well the findings answer the research question that was originally posed in that qualitative study. So there is still some kind of critical appraisal of qualitative studies that goes on, and that's what we mean by assessing the strength of the evidence. How broad is the analysis of the study? How deep does the analysis go? How rich is it? How many different concepts does it bring up? Those kind of things feed into the strength of the evidence. And there are some tools that will help you to decide what the strength of the evidence is. But in terms of methodologic quality, as I say, it's a contested area within qualitative research. It does have to be done, though, if you're doing a full synthesis, a full systematic review. If you're doing a scoping review, arguably not, depending on what your research question is and the original purpose of the